Hello, my name is Ebony Love, and I am joined by Professor Michelle Jacobs. Today is Wednesday, August 2nd, 2023, and we are recording this conversation via Zoom. I am physically located in Jacksonville, Florida, and Professor Jacobs is in DC. And so, Professor Jacobs, my first question is, how did you know that you wanted to be a lawyer?
Okay, that's an easy one actually. When I was 13, our school had a go to work with your parents day. And I should say I was at a predominantly white, all girls, specialized public high school in New York City. You had to take a test to get in there. So not everybody was in there. The schools, as I said, basically all white. And I believe in my class, there were 12 African-American girls in the class. So this was a go to work with your parents day. And some girl in the class father was a lawyer. So when they were assigning people to go out, I somehow ended up with the lawyers group, and he took us downtown Manhattan to Manhattan Criminal Court. And at the time, one of the Panther trials was going on. So I'm 13. So we go up into the courtroom. It has massive security. We get into the courtroom, and what you see is this Black man who was duct taped to a chair and gagged. So apparently the judge had protested the fact that had taken offense at the fact that he was insisting on saying what he believed to be true about the process. And they gagged him and they tied him to the chair so that he wouldn't be disruptive in the courtroom. So at 13 years old, I had no idea what lawyers do. I walk into that room and I see that, and my little child's mind says, I don't know what's going on here, but this can't possibly be right. And so whatever lawyers do, I think I want to be a lawyer because I want to make sure people don't get treated like that in a courtroom. So years go by, I pretty much stuck with that idea until I got to college, but then I had a family early. So, when you come out of college and you already have your family, your primary concern is to help support your family. So I didn't go to law school straight out of college as most people do. But one day I was at my job at AT&T at the time before the bells were all broken up in the antitrust litigation. And I noticed there's a park across the street from my office, and there was a very tall building on the other side of the park. So I had asked somebody, what is that building? And they said, it's the law school. So I was like, oh. And I walked across the street at lunchtime, went up to the admissions office, got an application and applied to go to law school at Rutgers University College of Law, Newark campus. And it was the only school I applied to, and the rest is history. Right. So they
Well,
accepted me, and that's where I went to law school.
and so taking just a little quick step back. So you went from high school, did you go straight into undergrad or did you take a break?
Yes. Actually, myself and my best friend, we advanced and left high school a year early. So I guess in today's language, you say you skipped a grade. But basically what we did was we went to Hunter College during the summer, took a bunch of college level courses, and that gave us enough credits so that we could graduate from the 11th grade. So I actually went to college right after I turned 17.
What year did you begin college?
That would have been 1971.
And how was it going to Princeton in 1971?
So we were the third class of women, right? So not only would you be the only Black person in your class, you would be the only woman in there too. So it was a it was a challenging environment. And I was discussing this with my friends not too long ago, but I believe that when we came into Princeton, we still had to sign the honor code. I pledge my honor as a gentleman. Um, so even though we were the third class, they hadn't adjusted the language yet. So we used to have all kinds of, highbrow debate about whether or not we had to actually comply with the code since we weren't gentlemen and we were being forced to pledge as gentlemen, and what was, so there you go, lawyer thinking already in college. Did we have to abide by the terms in the agreement when the agreement didn't accurately reflect who we were? So yeah, that was it. And for most people, I think for most people of color there at Princeton in those days, it was an unpleasant experience. So I'll even go so far as to say it was probably traumatic.
And so what did you have any personally traumatic experiences, or was it just the environment in general that made it so?
I think it was the environment in general, because not only, we were from New York City. And the thing people don't really realize about New York City is that it's highly segregated. So while you may all work in one place, like downtown, the neighborhood, the residential areas are segregated. So, you know, so white kids in Brooklyn at that time lived in Canarsie or Coney Island or something like that, and the neighborhoods were not integrated. So even though I went to school with white kids, I lived in Black and brown communities. So that's what I was accustomed to. And in New York, you New York City teenager, you think you know everything and you do what you want to do, and there's nothing to that. But when we got to Princeton, we're now confronted with not only being in an environment that's completely white all the time, right? Not just in class, but completely white all the time, in your dorm, in your eating facilities, wherever you are. But the class differences, so you're in an environment with a bunch of extremely wealthy people. And a lot of people don't know this, but Princeton has traditionally had a very high enrollment by Southern elites. So in addition to that, you get the Southern racist crap that comes along with Southern elites being in an academic setting. And that was a constant problem, particularly for the Black male students who were from urban environments, because they were just not going to tolerate, foolishness that the Southern male elites thought that they were entitled by, I guess, birth, to be able to engage in inappropriate behavior. And the Black guys from New York, from Oklahoma City, from just Chicago, they were just not having that. And so there was always tension, we'll call it that. There was always some tension on campus whenever those groups would confront each other. So, there was that to deal with as well.
And did you have any social groups for the Black community? For example, today we would call it something like the Black Student Union.
So yeah, they did have that. And I want to say that I think it was my group that created the Third World Center, which is now called something else. But yeah, they did that. Shortly after that, the boycott against South Africa was going. These are all things that were contemporary for that period of time. Although I will say that I left school after the first year and got married, and I came back 2 years later, having started my family. My husband at that time was also a Princeton student, so. Yeah, so when we came back to campus, we had a completely different existence from most Black students there because we lived, married students weren't allowed to live with the undergraduates. I don't know why, maybe, I don't know why. We, even though we were undergraduates, we had to live with the grad students because we were married. So I
Mm.
guess they figured undergrads didn't know about sex or whatever. I don't know what the issue was, but we were isolated from our our age peer group because we had to live on graduate student married housing. So the second part of my Princeton experience was very different from, I think, what my contemporaries were experiencing on main campus, because I was not a part of that.
And what was your favorite class in undergrad?
Okay, so I was what today we would call it Middle Eastern History and Language, but at Princeton it's always called Near Eastern History and Language. So I'm a history buff to this day. But of course, because it's dealing with the Middle East, I got to do some really fascinating work around the Arab views, Arab/Islamic views towards slavery. So when I was a junior at Princeton, I translated, there was a document from the 18th century and nobody knew what to do with it or how to fit it into the history of the time. So I took it and I translated it, and I worked with a Black grad student who was looking at that historical period of time. And actually what it was a treatise for slavers on which sub-Saharan Africans could be enslaved and which ones couldn't be because they had converted to Islam. So that's what the document was. I translated that. He did the historical context and we presented it at a Ford Foundation conference when I was a junior. I think he was a second year grad student. And so that was the kind of work you could do at Princeton if you found a department that fit you, and if you had your supervising faculty took an interest in you and really supported you. So that was great. And that document today still serves as the foundation for a lot of historical and legal research around Islam and slavery. So I have to say that was my all-time favorite.
Okay, and I promise this is all going to make sense, but I'm going to fast forward just a little bit.
Yeah, it's your interview. You can do it however you want.
So you graduate from Princeton and you start working at AT&T to support your family.
Mm.
And you see a building across the street and you find out that it's Rutgers Law School. How did you apply to Rutgers? What was that application process like?
So I went across the street. I got the physical application. I took it home that night. I filled it out and I walked it back across the street the next day. And that's pretty much what it was. You had to take the LSAT, write your essay. It's the same process. It hasn't changed in any kind of way. I did try to, so I originally was hired by New Jersey Bell, but as I say, this was before the antitrust lawsuit that broke up the Bells. And so you could be at New Jersey Bell and also work for AT&T, and it was just all the same. It was all the same conglomerate, right? So I eventually went from the New Jersey Bell division to the AT&T division in Newark, which is where the law school was. And they had a program where they would pay tuition if the employees went to school, if they were going to school while they were employees. So I was like, okay, fine, I'll go to law school at night and I'll have Bell. I'll have AT&T pay for a portion of my tuition because they do have a law division, and that all works. So I tried to do that, and my supervisor, who was a white woman, was like, no, they'll never pay for that. And I'm like, why shouldn't they pay for it? I'm an employee. Here's the regulations, blah, blah, blah. And she's like, no, they would never hire you in legal. And I'm like, so now we're going to have to find it out, right? So I'm like, why wouldn't they hire me in legal? And she says, they just wouldn't, right? So, okay, fine. At the time, AT&T was had this program, I don't remember the name of it now, but they were hiring recent college grads and training them for management positions. And so the class that I came in with, was mixed race and mixed gender. The men tended to go into the engineering departments. In fact, my kid's father was hired as well. And the women were put into either marketing or at the time they called it operator services. So you people are too young to understand this, but before cell phones, if you say we're on a boat and you needed to make a phone call, you had to go through a human operator to make that connection for you. And you would dial into the station, and the human operator, using a series of chords and things, would make the connection for you. And even if you wanted to make a long distance call, that had started to be automated, but you still needed a human operator to get you to the overseas connection. So that all was being phased out because of, progress and computerizing things, but they would put all the Black college trainees into operator services, and they would put all the white girls into marketing. And even if there was a white person put into operator services, they would give them an office that already had an efficiency rating of like 85 or 90. And the Black women would be put into an office that had an efficiency rating of like 65. And you would be told, okay, within a year, right, you got to get the office up to 85% efficiency. So I know that some of the white women who came in with me had been promoted 2 or 3 times. And I was still on my first promotion, even though I did take my office up in the efficiency. So I decided, okay, I'm going to law school. I'm going to go up the ranks that way. And when they told me, no, that wasn't going to happen, I said, okay, let me get a plan. So AT&T had this process internally where people knew I was very unhappy with the fact that these white women were being promoted and I hadn't been promoted, and I was just doing a bang up job at work. So they also knew that my boss said that they wouldn't reimburse me for the tuition. So I heard some people talking about it, and they were like, no, she's going to quit. And I heard my boss say, no, she can't quit. She's got those 2 kids. Right. So she thought she had me over an economic barrel, and that they were going to use that to deny me what I was entitled to. So I was like, okay, let me figure this out. And AT&T had this process where they had a series of days where they would make promotion announcements. So if it was a small promotion, it would be announced on a Tuesday. If it was like a medium-sized promotion, it would be announced on a Wednesday. But if it was a big promotion, they would announce it on a Friday. So anyway, I go to school. I start going to school at night. I hear in the wind that they're going to finally promote me to something, but it's not to director, like a regional director like it should have been. So I was like, okay, I got something for them. So the week that the announcement was supposed to come out, the small announcement was made on the Tuesday. The medium announcement came in on the Wednesday. The Friday announcements were always made at 3:00. On Friday at 2:30, I quit. I still remember the look on my boss's face when she was like, you can't quit. And I'm like, oh, I can. Right. And I'm quitting right now. So of course that caused chaos and confusion. I had to go through like a very top level exit interview because, now I had messed up their plan for, I guess, for diversity. I don't know, whatever. But I did quit and I started going to law school full time. And that's how it went. So
And when you went to law school, and you said that you went full time, did you go during the day? Were there night classes? How was that
I
experience?
started at night because I was working.
Mhm.
I would drive from Bergen County, New Jersey to Newark to go to work. I would drive back to Bergen County to pick up my kids and feed them. And then I would drive back to Newark to go to class all night and spend some time in the library. And so I did that for an entire semester. And then when I switched over, I just became a regular full-time day student.
And what years were you at Rutgers?
So I started there in 79 and I graduated in 82.
Really random question. Did you know someone named Harold Spence when you were at Rutgers?
Harold Spencer, a student?
Yes, he would have been a student.
I don't remember the name. I don't think he was in my cohort.
Okay, I only asked because he went from Morehouse and then he went to Rutgers, but I don't know what year he
Did
graduated.
he go to Rutgers Newark or did he go to Rutgers Camden?
That's a great question. I think he may have gone to Camden.
Yeah, so we don't know any of the students who went to Camden because Camden could as well as be in another state.
Okay.
It's 3 hours from Newark by car. So yeah, today the university has unified some of the campuses, but the law schools are still separate.
And so when you were in law school, what was the kind of racial demographic?
Okay, so the interesting thing about Rutgers Newark, it was called the People's Electric Law School. Yeah, and that was because during the riots in the 60s, the people in Newark were going to burn down the law school. Right? Because they were like, you're taking up all this space in our city, you don't contribute, there's nothing positive coming out to the community from that institution. And so that really caused the school to do some reflection, and they created what they call the Minority Student Admission Program. The interesting thing about their program, which is why it could never be attacked in court, although people tried repeatedly, both while I was there and after, is because the minority admissions program was based on students who were disadvantaged. So you could be disadvantaged either because of your race or you could be disadvantaged economically. So we had quite a few poor whites who came into the school under the minority student admission program. But of course, once they got into the school, they didn't tell anybody they were MAP students because it was embarrassing to them. But the one guy that I remember to this day was from Canada. He had been a hockey player. And, he was a great hockey player, but he wasn't particularly well-educated or wealthy. And so he wanted to be a lawyer and he applied to come to Rutgers, and he was admitted through the minority student law program. Fast forward, 30 years, he became the manager of the Washington Capitals hockey team. And he never denied that he was a minority student admit, because he felt it was important for people to know there's poor white people, they're disadvantaged, and sometimes they need a hand up to help make it in the world. And so he never disavowed being part of the minority admissions program. And I always thought he was a great example of how, if people really wanted, if they were committed to really something that was diverse, there are, of course, ways to do it that makes sense and don't hurt anybody. So I want to say in those days, it's probably not true today, but in those days, the minority admissions program admitted 40% of the class.
Okay. And to be clear, when you said the riots of the 60s, are you referring to the riots after Walter, oh my goodness,
After Martin Luther King was killed.
Martin Luther King. Okay. I get my decades mixed up. I think
as well. It's the same riot happening.
Yeah.
Over and over, so it's easy to get that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's easy.
Okay, so Rutgers, your student, did you have to take the same kind of first year law classes that we have to take today, or was it?
Absolutely the same. Although
Okay.
I will say that most of our classes were 1.5 to 2 hours long. So it wasn't like what you guys have, that 50-minute, blink. No, we were in there really having to concentrate and pay attention for more than 50 minutes. And back in those days, nobody would have come to school in a pair of cutoff shorts.
Mhm.
It just wasn't done.
So you were wearing suits and professional wear to class?
You might not be in a suit, although many people were, but you had on some kind of professional attire. You didn't come to class in shorts and flip-flops. That was not a thing.
And how did that lend to your law school experience, in the sense of, did it make the environment seem as if, taking a step back, when I was in law school, it doesn't seem as if your Juris Doctor degree is at the level that it is, because people come very relaxed. And so having that kind of, not necessarily explicit expectation, but everyone is dressing the same, you're having those longer classes, did that kind of make it
I think
real?
so. Yeah, I think so, because it's a serious endeavor. Everyone was in there to do something serious. Now, again, I don't know how it is today, because this is 40 years ago, but at the time, particularly the Black students, we were there for a reason, right? We were there for a reason. You were attracted to Rutgers for a reason. We had some of the first clinics, right? There's a case, what's the name of the case? It challenges the financing school budgets with real property tax. I can't call the name of the case, but that case started as a clinic challenge to funding schools with real property taxes. The Rutgers Law School clinics started that case. It went up and down to the New Jersey Supreme Court 3 or 4 times. But it started at Rutgers, the People's Electric Law School. It started there. And to this day, the school has a very strong clinical program. I want to say that Ruth Bader Ginsburg either taught there, I want to say she taught there for a hot second, somewhere in her career. But we had a lot of the civil rights movers and shakers would come in. They were either on the faculty or they did, guest seminars and things like that. It was a serious endeavor. And that's what we were there to do, and that's how people took it. The Rutgers Black Law Student Association predates BALSA, predates the national formation of BALSA. So our Black Student Law Student Association is not called BALSA because we existed before BALSA. And back in those days, if you wanted to be head of Student Bar Association or something like that, you had to come through the Black Law Students Association. It was that kind of thing. Movers and shakers, that's what we were. Keith Wright, who recently was the advisor to the Central Park 6 guy. Oh, gotta see, I should have looked his name up. Who's now on the city council.
Steph Salon?
Yeah, Keith Wright is one of my classmates. He's the son of Judge Bruce Wright, who was infamously called Turn 'em Loose Bruce because he constantly called out the racism in the New York criminal legal system. Yeah, and he spoke out against it, and he made his decisions from the bench based on his understanding of racism in the criminal legal system. So.
And when you say civil rights movers and shakers, are you talking specifically about legal professionals, or did you also
Yes,
have some
yes, legal professionals, people who were actually, you know, on the ground
Mhm.
during the struggle in Mississippi, in throughout the South and Alabama, wherever it was. Many of the lawyers who were associated with the NAACP also taught at the law school. So it was that kind of environment, and there was an expectation that if you came out of Rutgers, Newark, you were going to do public interest work. Now, of course, not everybody did, but we had the big law firm, Big Law, came and interviewed there as well. But there was kind of an expectation that you were going to do something that benefited the public.
And is that what led you to start your career by representing unions?
No, and not at all. So, as I said, I had this background from Princeton. I spoke 2 languages besides English. And I wanted to do international law because that's what the international sphere is what Princeton trained me to be in. So, of course, at that time, no one quite explained to me that there weren't any Black lawyers who did international law. And when I say there weren't any, I mean there were 0. So, but that wouldn't have deterred me, even if they had told me. It was something that I wanted to do, so I was going to go ahead and do that. And so I applied. At that time, you want to do that work, you have to apply to Big Law to do it. So I did my little Big Law application. I was on a law journal. I had good grades. I spoke these languages. I think I got 3 interviews, right? And in one, Fried Frank Harris. They're not called that anymore. They're Fried Frank now, something, but it's the same law firm. I went into the interview. I could see my resume on the guy's desk because it was printed on cream colored paper. And, my last name is Jacobs. And I went to this specialized high school in New York City, which is primarily for Jewish white girls. So I walk in the door, and the partner looks at the paper, and then he looks up at me, and then he looked back down at the paper again, because like he's in his mind, he's having cognitive dissonance, right? He's expecting a young Jewish woman to come in here, who went to Princeton, and to come in here and do this interview for this job at Fried Frank Harris. So time I just said, no, it's me. I'm Jacobs. I'm Michelle Jacobs, right? So, he covers. And we sit down to get the interview started. And, it didn't take long, about 7 or 8 minutes. I knew that it was a pro forma interview. And because I didn't have much sense when I was younger, I just looked at him. I said, look, you know what? My time is as valuable as your time. If this is a pro forma interview and you know right now that there's no possibility that you would ever consider me for a hire, let's just call it a day and go on about our business. And he stood up and he shook my hand and said, thanks for coming in. And that was the end of that. So had I been a little bit more thoughtful about it, I would have had a plan B. But I didn't have a plan B. Because I always go after what I want, and that's what I'm going to do. So I ended up being unemployed with 2 small kids to feed. So for 6 months, I did telephone surveys for a living and consumer surveys, and I made my rent plus, I think, $20. So and during this process, I'm trying to interview, get jobs. And this is, when Black people have elite credentials, this is the little problem that you can have, because when you're applying to, let's call it a regular job, the people will look at you and say, oh, you're overqualified. You're not going to want to be here. You're not going to stay, whatever. And then when you try to get an elite job, they're like, oh, you're not white. So nobody wants to hire you. You can't fit in anywhere, right? But my one of my good law school friends, his father was a judge in New York, not Judge Wright, but one of the other judges, and he arranged for me to get an interview at DC 37, which is the DC 37 Municipal Employees Legal Services. And again, at that interview, the guy was like, but look at your credentials. You're not going to want to do this work. I'm like, dude, I have a family to feed. I've been unemployed for 6 months. I'm going to do whatever job I need to do in order to feed my family. And my skills are good. So long story short, they hired me. And yeah, that was an interesting experience being there.
And interesting how.
Interesting in that the lawyers were union members because we were representing a union, so everybody was a union member. But it was my first exposure to, the people who are listening can't see air quotes, but I'm air quoting the legal services mentality, where lawyers thought they knew best what to do for these poor people. The DC 37 employees were the lowest paid of the New York City employees. So we didn't represent, for example, fire and police. They had their own unions and they had their own representation. We represented the token clerks, the clerk at the courthouse, folks like that, regular people. So I often found myself at odds with the primarily white legal staff over how to evaluate what the client needed. So, as you know, many white lawyers who are public service interest oriented can be somewhat paternalistic in how they approach dealing with the very complicated lives of poor Black people. And so they'll make decisions that they think are correct within the context of their cultural experience, which may or may not be the best decision for the client in the context of the situation the client is in. So my supervisor and I would often knock heads on that because she was very legal services minded in terms of, no, this is how we do it, blah, 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 blah. And I would be like, well, this client doesn't want that, right? And whether that's how we usually do it or not, this client has stated they don't want that. So shouldn't we be doing what the client wants? So anyway, back and forth it went. I had a number of lovely experiences and some not so lovely. This is when you start finding out that even when you wear that bow tie blouse, which was popular at the time, with your suit and your little briefcase, the bailiff in the courtroom is still going to refer to you as the defendant. Right? Because in their mind, they can't envision that you might actually be a lawyer. And that would happen no matter where in the city you needed to go to have your case heard. But nonetheless, I stayed there. I did the work. It was fine. All law jobs, you can learn from every law job. There's no law job that you can't learn something from. And the question is, when you're in it, how do you approach it to see what skill set you can get out of the job so that when you get an opportunity to go to your next job, you can take, a skill set that you've already built up with you into the next job. And I did that. I got to go to court. We did court appearances, we did interviewing, we did counseling, we did negotiations. So, we really did the gambit. Whatever the client needed, that's what we did. We went on strike. Yeah, we did all of that.
And so you said that when you were 13 years old, you knew that you wanted to be a lawyer after seeing a defendant being gagged for. And so how did you make it into the criminal legal system?
Right. So, okay, because coming out of law school, I was like, I'm not doing that criminal work. Because, that's how law school trains you. You come in with one mindset, and then you get in there. And even at a progressive school like Rutgers, you're still impacted by the law's primary purpose, which is to protect property. So, I was doing civil work at DC 37. So after that, my mom was a real estate broker in New Jersey. And there was an organization called Fair Housing Association of Northern New Jersey, and they represented people who had experienced housing discrimination. So if they were looking to buy a house and they went to see the house and the realtor tried to tell them it wasn't available, or if the realtor actually showed them the house and then the owner said it's not available, we sold it this morning, whatever, we would put together, we would assemble a team of testers who fit the prospective buyer or renter's profile except for race. And we would send the tester out, and if the tester was offered the housing, I would go to federal court and file an injunction to keep the get a restraining order to keep the property owner from selling or leasing the property until we could have a hearing as to whether or not they violated the Fair Housing Act. So that's what I did next. That was fun. It took me to federal court, which was a very rarefied environment for a Black lawyer at that time. And I was doing civil rights work. So, I'm in the public interest space. I'm doing something good. I'm trying to stop racism and all that. Yeah, so that was that. And then if we won or we settled the case, our office would, as part of the settlement, require that the realtors go through compliance training to make sure that they didn't violate the law again. And I would, as the lawyer for the agency, I would do that compliance training. And then sometimes if we had a really big case, like we had a case against an apartment complex that had something like 400 or 500 units in the whole complex. It was a huge complex, and they were clearly discriminating against Blacks and Latinos. So we had a plaintiff who was denied a unit, and we represented her. The interesting thing about that was that if it was a huge complex like that, the Justice Department would like to get a piece in. So they would send FBI to work with us to investigate whatever happens in the complex to see if they can make the federal case. And we would eventually either give them the case or have them come in on the case. So I got a chance to get to know justice. I got a chance to work with FBI agents on a civil rights matter. So while I was doing that, work and loving it, the same guy whose father was a judge had a cousin who was a law graduate, who became a target of a Rudy Giuliani prosecution in the Southern District of New York. So Rudy sent 500 SWAT team members to arrest 8 Black and 1 Latino person. I think half of them were lawyers. The other half were all college graduates. And Rudy brought a RICO prosecution against them, had the Joint Terrorist Task Force on the case, that these were some radical whatever. It was in the New York Times for days on end. The Preventative Detention Act of 1984 had just been passed, and they used that to try to detain the defendants without bail, on the grounds that they were a threat to the community. So the bail hearings lasted a full week. And at the end, only one defendant was held without bail, and he did eventually get bail. But so as it went on, it turns out that the defendants had a very particular idea of how they wanted to be represented. They wanted to participate fully in the decisions that were being made on the legal case. And it was a federal case down in the Southern District of New York. And almost all the lawyers, except for 3 or 4 in the Southern District, were white. So the lawyers kept quitting. Right, the lawyers kept quitting because they weren't going to take orders from these Black people about what legal decisions should be made. The judge on the case was Judge Robert Carter, who had been one of the NAACP, the Inc. Fund lawyers during the school desegregation litigation. So Judge Carter sees these Black defendants in front of him and knows that they're facing incredible amounts of time in prison should the case not go well. So he calls a halt to the whole thing. And he says to the defendants, find some lawyers that you trust who can try this case, that you're willing to work with to represent you and try this case. Okay, so after that happened, I get a phone call. I've been summoned to come down to Manhattan Detention Center behind the federal courthouse to be interviewed by the defendant. So I'm like, I don't do criminal work. I'm a civil rights lawyer. I don't do criminal work. But again, one of the defendants is my good friends, the guy who ended up being my law partner, is his cousin. So we go down and they're interviewing, lawyers left and right. And I say, well, thank you for inviting me. I don't do criminal work. I do federal civil work. That's what I do. I have trial experience there. I know the federal system, but on the civil side, right? And at the moment, I'm completely happy doing that work. So they're like, no, we think you'd be good for the case. I'm like, no, you're not hearing me. I don't do criminal work. I don't do it. So we go to the interview. I'm thinking that's the end of it. And then a couple of weeks later, I got a call from the judge's clerk. Judge Carter wants you to be in the courtroom on such and such a day. He's bringing all the new lawyers in. And I'm like, oh, I'm not on the case. I don't do criminal work. And the clerk, in a very dry kind of way, and after you get to know him, he was a very funny guy and very nice, but in a very dry kind of way, he says, okay, so you're asking me to tell the judge that you're not going to come in on the time that he has assigned you. And I'm thinking to myself, oh God, this is not going to be good. So I'm like, okay, all right. I'll come in, but I'm going to tell the judge I don't do criminal work. We get in, the whole new legal team is in there, and the judge is like, so Ms. Jacobs, I'm going to assign you to this case. And I'm like, what judge, I don't do criminal work. I've never done a criminal case. I'm on the civil rights side. And he says, okay, so federal prison. I'm like, oh, this is not going well. So, he assigns me and the other lawyers to the case. And that was that. That's how it all happened.
Okay.
I ended up with the number 2 defendant. Having ever tried a criminal case. But there were some excellent lawyers on the team who were famous. And I must say, if I had to do trial by fire, there wasn't a better group of mentors that I could have had than those lawyers who were on the case. So at the end of that all, the judge wanted to put me on the panel of lawyers who can accept federal criminal cases. So I put my application in and got the interview, whatever. And they told the judge, well, we don't want to put her on because she's only had the one criminal case. And the judge is like, listen, that case was before me for a year. The trial lasted 3 months. That was her first criminal case, and she was not the least experienced lawyer on the team, right? Put her on the panel. So that's how I got on the panel, and there were 2 Black women on the panel. We were both named Michelle, but we were 2 Black women and I think 2 Black guys out of the 125 lawyers who were on the panel. It was just the 4 of us. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm trying to be respectful of your time. So
yeah, I'm good.
Okay, we're gonna do one more pivot and then kind of wrap it up. But so now you're on call for criminal cases.
Yeah.
At what point did you decide that you wanted to start teaching?
Okay, so while we were doing the criminal work, I did criminal work in the federal court. I had some trials in the state court as private counsel, right? And I also did some trial work in New Jersey because I was licensed in both places. So by then I had built up quite a bit of trial experience in a fairly short period of time. Because Rudy Giuliani was arresting everyone in New York City, if it would give him the front page of the New York Times, right? So we had a joke that he would arrest his mom if it would put him on the front page of the New York Times. So we got plenty of work. And when you're assigned, the federal government pays you, and the federal rate was much, much higher than the state rate. So you could actually make a living doing that. So and then I think it was the New York City bar. There's the New York City bar, there's the New York State bar. New York has like a gazillion bar associations, but the New York City bar does a lot of CLE. So they were running a course on how to train lawyers who were transitioning from doing civil litigation into criminal litigation, so that they would be, familiar with what the differences are between the two different types of litigation. And I was one of the instructors in that CLE program. So after the program, somebody came up to me and said, Rutgers Law School has a clinical position open, and I think you're a good teacher. I think you would do well in that. So I was like, well, I graduated from Rutgers. I don't know. I want to go back there. And they were like, no. You should check it out. So I did. I put in the application. They scheduled the interview. The interview was on the day that Nelson Mandela had just gotten out of prison, and he had come to New York, and they were having a big thing for him at Yankee Stadium in New York. And that was the day of my interview. So I called the people up, and I'm like, look, I'll appreciate it if you don't want to reschedule this, but I'm not coming to the interview because I got to go see Nelson Mandela, and they were like, of course you have to go see Nelson Mandela, go reschedule the interview. Right, so they rescheduled the interview, and I ended up being hired at Rutgers, and I stayed there for 3 years. And then people said, they started giving my name out to law schools who were looking for tenure track people, and they were like, yeah, here's some schools we think you should work there. But the funny thing is, you just never know how these things are gonna work out, right? And sometimes when you're in law school, you can't appreciate how the choices that you make while you're in law school are gonna impact you for the rest of the time, right? So in order to be a law teacher, you have to have published or been on a law review. Back then, being on a law review was good enough. Today, you have to publish, but and I had been on a law review, not because somebody told me, not because somebody advised me that would help keep a career path open, but I did it because Rutgers had one of the first women's rights law reporters. And I was like, yes, this is something I'm interested in, legal rights for women, particularly back then when you didn't have any protection against domestic violence, just all the kinds of things that were happening to women back then. So I was a staff member of the Women's Rights Law Reporter. That if that had not happened, I would never have been able to go be a tenure track law professor, right? The other thing was that you had to, when you teach in the law field, you have to get a recommendation from every lawyer who has ever supervised you. So they're like, we have to talk to the woman who supervised you at DC 37. And I started laughing. I was like, well, she's not going to give me a good recommendation. They were like, well, why do you say that? I'm like, oh no, we fought like cats and dogs, and we did. I explained to you why. And sometimes we would literally be screaming at each other in the hallways because we had those little cubicle things and there was no privacy. So everyone knew it. When we were having a fight, it would just be all over the whole office. So they were like, well, we have to check, do you know where she is? And I'm like, no. Just true. I didn't know where she was, but I didn't know her name. So I gave the name. Turned out she was a judge by then in New York, right in New York City. So they contact her, and when we're finalizing the deal and everything, I said, did you ever reach the woman? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, and she gave me a bad recommendation, right? And they were like, no, actually, she said she was a pain in the ass. That was the best damn young lawyer I've ever had the privilege of training.
Mhm.
right? Because it was never about, uh, I don't like you, or she doesn't like me, or whatever. When we were fighting, it was about what was the proper representation for our client, right? What was going to put the client in the best situation going forward? And that's all I was ever concerned with. How can we help this person not just get out of this mess that they're in today, but be situated so that they won't be in a mess tomorrow, right? And she recognized that, and she appreciated it, and she valued it. So I was like, well, see, you just never know how that's all going to work out. That's,
And I'm sorry.
yeah, no, that was it.
Um, so I'm just gonna come out and ask the question.
Mhm.
How I'm not gonna laugh. Uh,
You can laugh. So how did I end up at UF?
Actually, how was your experience as a Black female law professor at the University of Florida?
Okay, so you know, you were there. It was basically horrible. But I will say this, and I've given some deep thought to this since I retired. I probably was the person that UF needed at the time, because they had had a Black woman, one Black woman law professor previous to my getting there, and she left and gone to Cornell and became associate provost there or something like that. But she was sort of run out of UF with their ridiculous racism. And you know, coming from out of New York and not having ever lived in the South, I wasn't afraid of the people in the South. And I wasn't going to be, I'm not a go along to get along kind of Black person, right? So, and I told them that in the interview. I'm like, this is who I am. So don't make me a job offer thinking you're going to get something else like these Black people you're accustomed to dealing with, because I'm not that person, right? I'm not that person. I'm a Black woman from New York City. I speak my mind. I stand up for my rights, and I always protect those who are being abused or oppressed. And that's who I am. So if you're going to make me an offer, that's who you're going to get. And I guess they probably didn't believe that, but that's what they got.
And while you were at UF, or actually any university that you taught at, did you have any lessons that you hoped that your students got that were not necessarily coming straight from the case books?
Well, you know, I've taught at Columbia, Rutgers, Howard, and UF. The students at Columbia, Howard, and Rutgers were already motivated to do what was right, and they were public interest minded. So I'm not saying that they always did their work, because, you know, students, I was a student myself, and there were those times where you just don't get it done. But I didn't have to teach them about the way life works or how they would be treated as a person of color in the legal profession. They knew that, right? And we had already built up the tools and the skill sets to deal with that. I found that almost completely lacking in the UF law students. And it was often a struggle. My main goal there was to get them to do the best that they could do. Because, as you know, the level of practice that was reflected in Gainesville was pretty low. So students would often say, well, I can do this and it will work downtown, right? And I'm like, I'm not trying to make you a lawyer that's better than the lawyers downtown. I want you to be an excellent lawyer who can go anywhere at any time and be on par with the best lawyer in that environment. That's what I'm trying to get you to do. I don't know that I was as successful with that as I would have liked, but you know, that was my goal. To, one, respect the law, but know its limitations. Know that it does violence to poor people, and that part of the lawyer's job was to mitigate the violence that law does to poor people, and to just come out and be the best that they could absolutely be the best lawyer you can be at all times, no matter what, right? And that's what has motivated me all these years. This is what we're in 2023. I was admitted to practice in 1982. So I've been a lawyer for 41 years. There is no piece of my law experience that I regretted. And I have never wished that I was something other than a lawyer, professionally. You know what I'm saying? And I feel badly for many of the law students that I've taught. They didn't love the law. They didn't appreciate the majesty of it, the terrible violence of it, or the power that it gave them as a lawyer. They simply were not able to understand that and appreciate it. And I've talked to young lawyers who are like, I'm going to do this for 10 years and then I'll do something else. And that is mind-boggling to me. It's a profession. It's not like working at Macy's. It's not like you're going to go work at Macy's for 10 years and then go do something else. It's a profession. It's something that you do your entire life, although you may do different aspects of it throughout your career. Yeah, and so I'm sad for today's lawyers and law students that many of them will not have the really rich, wonderful experience that I have had in the law. And all of my friends who graduated in my age cohort from law school, we all feel the same way. We'll still get together and just do law talk, right? If we're all together, and the spouses and the significant others, they know they have to leave the room or go into a different corner because we're going to do law talk. And for hours, we'll do law talk, right? Because we love it, we enjoy it. And I don't see that today. I don't see it. And it makes me sad. When all this stuff was going on in Florida, I contacted some of my students and I trained you. I taught you. Why aren't you standing up to, where's your firm? Why aren't you standing up to this DeSantis guy? Everything he does is unconstitutional. And then there was always some backfill story about why they couldn't stand up for people. And that made me sad.
Two really quick points. I don't know if this is more me editorializing or if there's actually a question in this, but I do know that it's something with my generation. I try to stay off of social media, but somebody had made the point that, we need to not just make our entire lives about being lawyers, and that it's weird that if you go into this profession and make that your persona, that you shouldn't be proud about something like that. And I guess, and this isn't to just say this to agree with you, I think it's just something that I inherently believe, is that this is a field that there's so much to explore, and there's so many opportunities that even if you don't want to be someone who's in a courtroom every day, you still have the opportunity to write, to research, things like that. And so I don't know if it's something that's emblematic of being at UF or being in the South. I don't know, or maybe it's just something in my generation, with all of these battling interests. And
I think one of the things you all confuse who you are with what you do.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a lawyer by profession. I'm a Black woman, activist. That's who I am, right? And I have a whole bunch of other interests that are both cultural and social. But my job is that I'm a lawyer. I'm part of the legal community. It's not who I am, it's what I do. And I think that that's the piece some young people are missing. Lawyers, what you do for a living, but there's more to you than that, right? There's your community. I don't know if you were in the class when I asked people, How many of you do community work? And a whole bunch of people raised their hand, and I'm like, oh yeah, where? What community are you part of? And the only answer people could give was their church, right? Because they didn't actually belong to a community. They weren't in a community. They were just at law school doing their thing, whatever. And you see that for us as Black lawyers, I don't see how that's possible. You have to be part of a community because your community helps you define who you are. You know, it sets the parameters for what's important. Law doesn't do that. It's your community. It's who you are as a person that does that. And I think too many young people are disconnected from a community because they live in apartment complexes. You know, they've been raised in apartment complexes. They don't know their neighbor, you know, on and on and on it goes. And, you know, it can't work that way. It can't.
And so we're wrapping up. We're not at the end. We're getting there though. Again, I'm trying to be respectful.
No, I'm fine. You know, because you know me, I'll answer the questions because it's, you know, I'm older now. I'm not going to be here forever. And it's important for people to understand what made my generation be the kind of lawyers that we became, right?
Yeah, and that's why I'm trying to have these conversations with older attorneys and judges, and then bringing those conversations and trying to link them with people who would like to become attorneys in the future.
Yeah.
And so my next kind of question is, how did you know that it was time for you to leave Florida and retire?
Okay, so I had actually stayed beyond the point where I thought I was going to retire. COVID happened, and since I could teach remotely, you know, I was okay with that. But then the craziness started with, you know, DeSantis. Even before he started the whole attack on critical race theory, you know, at UF, it became apparent that he was interested in a takeover of the public universities. And the types of things that were coming out were sounding very Jim Crow-ish. And now we know that they in fact are Jim Crow-ish. And so, you know, from my perspective, it's like this. I'm going to fight a good fight, but I'm not going to fight the same thing over and over, right? That's nonsensical. I was born in 1954, the year Brown versus Board of Ed was decided. I was 10 years old before massive resistance ended and schools were ordered to desegregate. The Voting Rights Act was 1964, the Civil Rights Act was 1965, okay? So I'm 10 and 11 years old when that happens. President Kennedy was assassinated when I was in the 4th grade. Malcolm X shortly thereafter. Martin Luther King was assassinated when I was 14. And Bobby Kennedy shortly thereafter, right? This is my lived experience. This is my lived experience. I'm not going to go back to the generation that did that, that caused that damage. I'm not going to go back to the period where people had to step off the street when a white person walked by, or lower their eyes, or sit in the back of a classroom. I'm not going to do that. And you know what? Most of the rest of this country has moved beyond that. So if the failed rebellion states insist on trying to recreate their failed history, all right, well, somebody else is going to have to work them through that. But I've been there, I've done that. You know, I'm talking about creating a world that is equitable and just for everyone. I'm not interested in trying to convince some white supremacists that they need to give up their ideas about how the world works. Their ideas are not achievable. They are, you know, I don't know if you've seen the t-shirt Global Majority, but it's what the reality of the world is. The global majority in the world is Black and brown. It's not white. So you can get in your little cocoon and pretend that it's going to be that way, but it's not going to be that way, right? And it's not that way now. So, I'm not wasting any more time on those people because, in a sense, I don't know that they're redeemable. Let the people who live in Florida who want to preserve democracy and the protection of constitutional rights while staying in the state, let them fight that fight. I have other battles that I'm trying to fight that take me and the communities I care about forward into the future, not to the back. There's nothing for any of us in the back, right? It's nothing for those white people in the back. I heard a German, there's a German guy who's a lawyer, he's an expert on police violence. And so he was having a conversation about violence in the US and white supremacy and how it's tied to that. And he goes, in Germany, we had World War II. We had the Holocaust. It happened and it's over. We would never try to recreate or reenact the Holocaust, right? He says that's even nonsensical if you think about it. And so he couldn't really wrap his mind around why all these people do these Civil War reenactments. He literally couldn't wrap his mind around it. I said, well, they keep reenacting it because they're trying to change the result. And he started laughing. He's like, but it's history. That's what history is. Something happened and it's over. You can't go back and change it because it's done. And I'm like, yeah, but they keep trying. But I'm not going to keep trying to recreate the environment post Reconstruction. I'm looking at what kind of society can we build with these young people who are ready to go forward. So.
And that's actually my next question. What do you hope that the next generation, or even my generation of attorneys, accomplish?
So I'm hoping that the young attorneys will broaden their view of how you use law to create social change. I'm hoping that they realize they are not the center of change, that the communities have to be the center for change, and that each community, and here I'm not talking about, a subdivision, I'm talking about a broader community, but that each community has to decide for itself what it needs from their legal team and how those people can help them create the safe and secure future they want that's not dominated by the police and by politicians who are beholden to corporate interests over the lifeblood of the community. So that's what I'm hoping. I see it in some of I see some people having that. I'm really, let's see, my grandson is 14. The kids who are like 18-ish, I see that germinating in them. I don't know if when they get to law school, it will be beat out of them like it's beat out of so many people, but I'm hopeful now that that's the direction we'll move in. And I'm throwing my support behind young people because the older people have shown that they're not capable. My generation did what it could. I would have to say my daughter's generation didn't do as much as it could. But I do feel that is changing. How long it will change, I don't know. I told you, so let me just occurs to me, I didn't close off that thing about leaving UF. So ultimately, I decided I had done all I could do at UF, and it was time for me to step out of there because the school, the 28 years I was there, could not manage to get itself beyond, they would go right up to change, right up to it where you could smell it, and then back all the way back. And I think even Professor Nunn, who recruited me to come there, finally is like, no, it's not going to happen, right? And he's no longer there either. So yeah, you can't continue to waste your energy and your creative process with people who repeatedly tell you they don't want it. So okay, fine. If you don't want it, I'll take it somewhere else. And you know, and that's what I'm doing.
And again, another little editorial. When you say the people don't want it, are you talking about the institution, or are you talking about the students, or are you talking about one and the same?
So I think the institution primarily doesn't want it. Florida is a good example of an institution that consistently does lip service, but doesn't want to do any of the hard work of actually changing the institution. And I read a great piece on whether or not it's reasonable to demand that these big institutions like UF, whether it's reasonable to demand that they change, because they don't want to change. And their whole momentum is about status quo. So on some level, is it naive to believe that, you know, at any period of time, you can get these institutions to actually change? And I think it's a good question worth thinking about. You know, I've never been shy of saying that I think more people of color need to be educated in our own institutions, because the damage, the psychic damage that's done in these predominantly white institutions sometimes cannot be undone. And the damage is great.
Is there anything that I didn't ask you about that you would like to tell me?
You know, I don't know. We're always going to need lawyers. Poor people have very complicated legal issues. They don't always revolve around litigation, but they do revolve around problem solving, which is one of our greatest strengths as lawyers. We are the problem solvers, right? We are a helping profession. So even if you want to make the big bucks at big law, I think I think all lawyers of color have a moral obligation to find a community of color that is in need, preferably young, and help that community, help them survive and surpass the damage that's been done by 400 years of white supremacy. That's what I want young lawyers of color to be thinking about. It's a tall ask, I know, because it's hard. Put yourself in the shoes of a lawyer who's been trained by me or Professor Nunn, and DeSantis makes these crazy legislative enactments. You should be able to go to your firm and say, can we talk about a way to sue this guy? And if the firm balks, as I must say, many of my Black alums balked at the suggestion that they think about contesting. And it was always about, well, you know, our firm is trying to get its name on a classroom door at UF. And I'm like, really? You sell out your community to have your name on a classroom door? That's all it takes to buy you? Right? So on some level, I think we either have to come out of these racist institutions, or we've got to find a way to address the psychic trauma that happens when we go through these places. Yeah, it took me about 9 months to recover from UF, you know. And I remember the week that the recovery was complete. Right, I came out of the back of the apartment, and I said, oh, I need to get a calendar and start making some appointments for stuff that I want to do now, right? And that day, I got a sheet of paper and I started outlining the tasks that I wanted to accomplish. It took me 9 months to heal my mind so that I could recover myself.
Thank you so much for sharing your story.